We might well wonder whether ancient Greek civilization still has anything to say to us. Travel around Athens today, and you see that the modern city looms much larger than the traces of its past. And yet, just as we get the odd glimpse of old buildings, so too it's sometimes possible to catch a hint of the ideas the ancient Greeks have given us. Almost 2,500 years ago, a philosopher was born here. His name was Sócrates, and he's come to symbolize one of philosophy's most inspiring gifts to the rest of us. The idea that thinking logically about our lives might help us to be more certain of ourselves, more independent, less conformist, less hamstrung by what other people think. It's the dream that philosophy might set us free. I'd come to Athens to see how a man who famously died for his beliefs might give us the confidence to stand up for our own. Sócrates wrote nothing down, and we know what he said chiefly through a series of dialogues he features in, written by his pupil Plato. We're not even sure that this strange little statue is of him. We know he was born in 469 BC and was married to a famously shrewish woman called Xanthippe. When asked why he'd married her, he replied that a horse trainer had to practice on the most spirited animals. There is one fact about him that stands out. Among all ancient philosophers, he is perhaps the greatest. And there is no clearer evidence of this fact than that he's the only philosopher readily available as a fridge magnet. The magnet suggests another fact about Sócrates, that he was extraordinarily ugly. In the history of a subject with many notably ugly practitioners, he was surely the ugliest. Even his very good friends compared him to a stingray, a satyr, and a grotesque. He compounded his looks by almost never washing, rarely changing his cloak, and never wearing any sandals. It was said that he'd been born in order to spite shoemakers. Sócrates' idiosyncratic habits point the way to one of his most inspiring ideas, that we should find ways to build confidence in our own beliefs and not be too swayed by the opinions of others. There are great similarities between humans and sheep. We may not have wool on our backs or emit baaing sounds, but we often have an urge to follow our fellow creatures passively and have a horror of breaking away from the group. Why do we follow sheepishly behind other people, particularly important other people? Largely because we imagine they must know what they're talking about, and so we trot along behind them. Until 1998, Andrew Miller was a loyal employee at this company, British Biotech in Oxford, where he was Director of Clinical Research. But he began to think that his employers were being over-optimistic about the drugs they were developing, and that the shareholders weren't getting an accurate picture. He was forced to confront an agonizing question. Could it really be possible that he was right, even though all 11 members of the biotech board were against him? What does it feel like to be one man thinking that something that you're saying is right, and 11 other people saying, no, you're wrong? What does that feel like?
Well, it's a frustrating situation. It's,
Is it terrifying as well?
I wouldn't say terrifying, but it is preoccupying, and it does stop you sleeping, and you do, your mind does start to play tricks on you that do make you doubt your sanity to a certain extent, because one's previous experience in a democracy is overall, the majority tends to have a certain amount of right on its side. And to be honest, in a lot of ways, I was at my wit's end. I used to sit in my office, clutching my temples, thinking, have I got this wrong? Am I misinterpreting these things? I mean, the science and the technology can be thought of as complicated and confusing. But for me, it's my everyday work, and I understand it well. And you start doubting your own sanity. You think, why is it? Why do I think this, and these 11 guys who are on the board think differently?
Tell me a bit about the pressure to conform in a company like British Biotech.
Well, I think in all companies there are pressures to conform. There are cultures in all companies. you know, these are people who you like and who you're working with. And actually what you want to do is to, you know, appease them. They're your bosses. You are wanting to appease them. You are wanting to help them. You are wanting to work with them. You want to be friends with them.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
The first reason why it's hard to feel confident in Andrew's situation is that we tend to accept that people in authority must be right.
The European community has said this beef is utterly safe.
It's this assumption that Socrates wanted us to challenge, by urging us to think logically about the nonsense they often come out with, rather than being struck dumb by their aura of importance and air of suave certainty.
Start a fight to cut out the cancer of bent and twisted journalism in our country, with the simple sword of truth and the trusty shield of traditional British fair play, so be it.
In deciding when to follow prominent people and when to disagree with them, Socrates had one huge advantage over us. He could always talk to them in person. Athens in his day had a population of just 150,000, and all the citizens came here to the Agora, the main market and meeting place of Athens. If you'd have visited in the 5th century BC, you'd have been likely to see, amongst the bustle of the city, a rather curious, ugly figure. Because for most of his adult life, Socrates got up at dawn and came to spend the day amongst the shopkeepers and merchants who had their stalls here. It wasn't just local people who came to this spot. It was also the most important people in Athenian society, so that you could meet here at any point in the day, probably, as it were, the opinion formers, the great military generals, the great statesmen, the important rhetoricians, the aristocrats. They could all be found here. And what Socrates did, rather than just idly chatting to people, he would go up to these very important people and ask them great questions on life. He'd basically ask them to explain why they were living the kind of life they were leading. And what happened is that he found there were surprising inadequacies in their understanding of the way of life they were leading, so that wealthy people couldn't really explain why they had money and others didn't. Military generals couldn't explain why they fought battles in a certain way. And I think we take away from this a fascinating lesson, which is that if you have the luck, or at least the courage, to go up to important people and question the way that they're leading their lives, you might be able to find surprising inadequacies of which their very confident demeanour gave absolutely no indication.